At 6 a.m. GMT on April 1st, 2026, three governments on two continents made simultaneous announcements that most Western energy ministers had privately assessed as theoretically possible, but practically inconceivable. The transitional government of Niger, Aznikchim, which controls the Arlit uranium mining district, the fifth largest uranium deposit on Earth, declared an immediate suspension of all uranium export licenses to France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and their treaty allies, effective immediately, no grace period, no transition arrangement, effective at 6 a.m. GMT. 40 seconds later, the government of Namibia, operator of the Russing and Husab mines that together produce approximately 10% of global uranium supply, issued an identical declaration. Suspension of export licenses to the same list of countries. Effective at 6 a.m. GMT. 40 seconds after that, the Republic of Kazakhstan, the world's single largest uranium producer, accounting for approximately 43% of global mine production, announced the suspension of uranium delivery contracts with Western buyers, citing the ongoing militarization of global energy markets by NATO member states as justification under force majeure clauses in existing supply agreements. Three countries, two continents. 40 seconds apart. 35% of global uranium supply gone from Western markets before the morning shift at most European nuclear utilities had begun. This did not happen spontaneously. The coordination required weeks of diplomatic preparation, legal review of contract terms, and the kind of simultaneous execution that only occurs when a larger actor has provided the organizational infrastructure to make it happen. Western intelligence services have spent the last 6 hours identifying that larger actor. The answer is not surprising. The supply chains that move uranium from Niger and Namibia to Western buyers pass through financial and logistics intermediaries that Iranian, Russian, and Chinese state-linked entities have been quietly acquiring stakes in since 2021. This is not an African initiative. It is an African face on a coordinated energy warfare operation. To understand why 35% of uranium supplies disappearing from Western markets in one morning is an existential threat to European energy security, not in years, but in months, you need to understand what uranium actually does in a modern economy and how little buffer exists between supply disruption and reactor shutdown. Nuclear power generates approximately 25% of Europe's electricity. France derives 70% of its electricity from nuclear. Belgium, 50%. Slovakia, 57%. Hungary, 48%. The Czech Republic, 40% to Sweden, 30%. These are not marginal contributions. In several countries, nuclear power is the difference between a functioning electrical grid and rolling blackouts. Nuclear fuel, the uranium pellets loaded into reactor fuel assemblies, is not consumed the way natural gas is consumed. A nuclear reactor does not burn uranium continuously and require daily replenishment. It loads a fuel cycle, typically 12 to 18 months of enriched uranium fuel, and runs on that load until the next refueling outage. This means that the immediate impact of a uranium supply disruption is not visible in today's reactor output. The reactors that are currently running will continue running on their existing fuel loads for weeks or months. The crisis arrives not when the supply is cut, but when the existing fuel runs out and there is no replacement ready. The question that every nuclear utility operator in Europe is running right now is, when is my next refueling outage and do I have the fuel for it? Let me give you the numbers that answer that question. European nuclear utilities typically maintain uranium inventories equivalent to approximately 12 to 24 months of forward consumption, a buffer built precisely for supply disruption scenarios. That buffer sounds reassuring until you understand two things about it. First, uranium is not a fungible commodity in its raw form. The uranium coming from Niger, Namibia, and Kazakhstan does not go directly into reactors. It goes through a conversion and enrichment process that takes approximately 12 to 18 months from mine output to finished fuel assemblies. The uranium sitting in European utility inventories today was mined 12 to 18 months ago. The uranium that will be needed for refueling outages in 2027 needs to be in the enrichment pipeline now. Second, the 12 to 24-month inventory buffer is an average across the industry. Individual utilities vary significantly. The utilities that have been managing inventories conservatively, buying forward, maintaining maximum buffers, are protected for 18 to 24 months. The utilities that have been managing inventories efficiently, just-in-time procurement, minimal forward buying, are protected for 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months. That is the distance between today's embargo announcement and the first European nuclear reactor that cannot complete its scheduled refueling outage. The first reactor shutdowns begin in late 2026, not because of the embargo happening today, because of the enrichment pipeline that was not filled 6 months ago. If you understand why a supply disruption that produces no immediate visible effect is more dangerous than one that produces immediate blackouts, subscribe right now, because the mainstream coverage is showing you uranium price charts and utility company statements. It is not explaining the 12 to 18-month enrichment pipeline lag that makes this crisis invisible until it is too late to prevent. Let me give you the pipeline mathematics. The process from raw uranium ore to finished nuclear fuel assembly has 4 stages: mining, conversion, enrichment, and fabrication. Each stage has limited global capacity and significant geographic concentration. Conversion, the chemical process that transforms uranium or concentrate into uranium hexafluoride gas suitable for enrichment, has 3 primary Western facilities: Cameco's facility in Ontario, Orano's facility in France, and Converdine's facility in Illinois. Combined Western conversion capacity: Chakanin, approximately 30,000 metric tons of uranium per year. Current Western demand, approximately 28,000 metric tons per year. Utilization rate, 93%. At 93% utilization, there is no surge capacity. If Niger, Namibia, and Kazakhstan's share of Western uranium supply, approximately 35%, needs to be replaced from other sources, those other sources would need to ramp up production by 35% above current levels. The alternative sources that can theoretically fill the gap: Australia currently supplies approximately 13% of global production, Canada approximately 15%, and Uzbekistan approximately 6%. Together, approximately 34%. The mathematics appear to work. Alternative suppliers could in theory replace the embargoing country's contribution to Western supply. Here is why theory does not equal practice. Australian and Canadian uranium production is already operating near capacity. Ramping up production at existing mines by 35% above current levels requires capital investment, equipment procurement, and workforce expansion that takes 18 to 36 months minimum. New mine development, the longer-term solution, takes 7 to 10 years from exploration to production. Uzbekistan's production can be increased modestly, perhaps 20 to 30% above current levels, within 12 months. But Uzbekistan is a landlocked country whose export routes pass through Russia or China, neither of which has demonstrated consistent willingness to facilitate Western supply chain resilience when it conflicts with their own strategic interests. The gap cannot be closed in the time available, not with existing infrastructure, not with existing production capacity, not with existing supply chain geography. Now let me tell you what the official responses look like, and where each one runs into a wall. The International Energy Agency activated its Emergency Oil Stockholding Mechanism, a coordination tool designed for petroleum supply disruptions, before recognizing that the IEA has no equivalent mechanism for uranium. The IEA's founding treaty, written in 1974 in response to the oil crisis, covers petroleum. Uranium is not petroleum. There is no International Emergency Uranium Stockholding Mechanism. There is no coordinating body with the authority to direct utility companies to share inventories, no strategic uranium reserve equivalent to the strategic petroleum reserve, and no established protocol for what European governments do when their nuclear fuel supply is disrupted by a coordinated geopolitical operation. The European Commission convened an emergency energy security meeting and announced it would explore all available options to ensure the continuity of nuclear fuel supply to member states. The available options are diplomatic pressure on Niger, Namibia, and Kazakhstan to reverse the embargo, acceleration of alternative supply contracts with Australia and Canada, drawdown of utility inventories with coordinated rationing, and long-term investment in domestic European uranium production, a process that would take a decade to produce meaningful supply. Diplomatic pressure on Niger faces a specific problem. The transitional government in Niamey came to power in a 2023 military coup that France refused to recognize. French troops were expelled from Niger in 2023. French uranium mining interests, Orano's operations at Arlit, were already under threat before this morning's announcement. The diplomatic relationship between France and Niger, from which France derives approximately 20% of its reactor uranium, is not a relationship that produces rapid concessions in response to Western pressure. Kazakhstan's force majeure declaration will be challenged in international arbitration by every Western utility with an existing supply contract. Arbitration timelines: 18 to 36 months. Timeline for the first European reactor fuel shortfalls: 6 to 9 months. The legal remedy arrives after the crisis it is supposed to prevent has already occurred. Here are the 3 scenarios for the next 18 months. Scenario 1. The embargo holds for 6 months and then partially breaks down as individual countries within the coordinating bloc calculate that the revenue loss from withheld uranium sales outweighs the political benefit of maintaining solidarity. Niger's government budget depends substantially on uranium royalties. At current uranium prices, which have already jumped 47% since the announcement, every month of withheld sales costs Niamey approximately $180 million in foregone revenue. In this scenario, Europe manages through the crisis with rationing, emergency import contracts from Australia and Canada at premium prices, and the shutdown of the 15 to 20 reactors with the shortest remaining fuel inventories. Electricity prices in France, Belgium, and Slovakia triple. Industrial production in energy-intensive sectors contracts by 20 to 30%. The economic damage is severe, but not civilization-ending. Scenario 2. The embargo holds for 18 months. The enrichment pipeline empties. The first reactor shutdowns begin in late 2026 and cascade through 2027 as fuel inventories reach their minimums. France shuts down 8 to 12 of its 56 operating reactors, reducing French electricity generation by 15 to 20%. Germany, which shut its remaining nuclear plants in 2023, cannot help. Norway and Sweden have limited hydropower surplus to share. European electricity prices reach levels that make 2022's energy crisis look manageable. Several European governments face the political consequences of blackout schedules in the winter of 2026-2027. In this scenario, the Middle East conflict has produced an energy crisis in Paris, Brussels, and Prague through a supply chain that runs through Niamey, Windhoek, and Nur-Sultan, cities that most European voters could not locate on a map 2 years ago. Scenario 3. The uranium embargo triggers a broader resource nationalism cascade. Ghana restricts bauxite exports. Congo restricts cobalt. Zambia restricts copper. Each restriction, individually manageable, collectively produces a commodities supply shock that hits the industrial base of every Western economy simultaneously. In this scenario, the coordinated uranium embargo was not the end of the operation. It was the proof of concept that resource-dependent Western economies can be pressured through supply chain geography in ways that military power cannot defend. Here is what you need to understand as we close. Europe generates 25% of its electricity from nuclear power. That nuclear power depends on uranium that comes primarily from countries that are not Western allies, processed through supply chains that pass through geographies that hostile powers have been quietly acquiring influence over since 2021. 35% of that uranium supply was suspended this morning, in 40 seconds, by 3 governments that coordinated their announcements to the second. The enrichment pipeline lag means the crisis is invisible for 6 to 9 months. The diplomatic tools available move slower than the physics of an emptying fuel inventory. The legal remedies arrive after the reactor shutdowns they were supposed to prevent. And the strategic uranium reserve that would allow Europe to absorb this shock does not exist, because no one created it in the decades when the supply chain appeared secure. Iran spent approximately $200 million over 5 years cultivating the political and financial relationships in Niger, Namibia, and Kazakhstan that made this morning's coordination possible. The potential damage: electricity rationing in France by winter 2026, industrial contraction across the European Union, political crises in 4 to 6 member states, and a nuclear power sector that takes 7 to 10 years to rebuild domestic supply chain resilience, even if the perfect policy is implemented the moment this video ends. $200 million, 5 years, 40 seconds, 92 reactors on a clock that started this morning. Share this video, because the coverage will show you uranium spot price charts and IEA statements and statements and diplomatic meetings and utility company reassurances about inventory levels. It will not explain the 12 to 18-month enrichment pipeline lag that makes this crisis invisible until it cannot be solved. It will not tell you that the IEA has no uranium emergency mechanism. It will not do the math on what happens to French electricity when 8 to 12 reactors run out of fuel in the winter of 2026. They will give you the version where supply chains adapt and alternatives are found, and the system demonstrates its resilience. I just gave you the version where the pipeline lag is already running. The alternatives take 18 to 36 months to scale. The legal remedies arrive after the damage, and 92 reactors are now on an inventory clock that nobody in Brussels knew how to read this time yesterday. 35% of Western uranium supply, 40 seconds, 92 reactors, and a strategic reserve that does not exist for the fuel that keeps the lights on in the world's most advanced economies. The missiles hit things you can see. This hits things you cannot see until the reactor goes dark and the grid goes with it.